absolutely is essential for our survival to use these powerful tools in the most humane and wise way. And the only way to guarantee that is not to shuffle the responsibility off to somebody else, but to make sure that every citizen understands science and technology to some extent.
Lighten up, Francis.
Clear skies, everyone. It's Francis, your host of Collision Course right here on friendships.com. Every Sunday from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern, you'll come here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in our solar neighborhood. Not just that, though. We're on a mission to uncover and discover the truth about our place in the universe. Come listen for the interviews. Come listen to me. Either way, we'll know more so we can decide what's real and what is not in the space outside our atmosphere. Everyone, welcome to another edition of Collision Course. Please welcome our guest today, Dr. Chandra. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you.
Everyone, I brought and invited and asked for an interview for Dr. Chandra because I find his information, even though I've just stumbled upon it, to be extremely interesting. And now, Dr. Chandra, I'm not going to start with the end first because there's a lot to talk about before we actually get to the end of the hour, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
And for the listeners, what we're going to learn from Dr. Chandra is his views on what the potential is for outer space and the universe to contain life and where it is and how it travels and how it moves through outer space and the universe. And Dr. Chandra, we're going to learn something very, very interesting that I don't think any of us have ever heard before. There's going to be a little bit about views on humanity and how we've gotten from the beginning to now. We're going to hear things about outer space that we probably never heard about and how life may play more of a prevalent role in outer space and how it moves through space. And of course, Earth is in space and we are in space, and we're going to learn a little bit about that. We're going to learn a little bit maybe about how that affects how we think about life, how it evolved. And then we're going to come to the end of the hour and we're going to discuss how what we just got done talking about life in space and how it moves affects a current condition that we're dealing with right now. But I'm not going to give that away because I want to wait to the end. And it is very important, and I think you're going to find it very, very interesting indeed. Dr. Chandra, let me start again. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You are coming to us from the UK?
Yes, that's right. I've been working here in the UK from 1960, very, very long time ago, before many of your listeners were born, perhaps.
But of course, I know that your field of study is so interesting that you really cannot get bored, even though you spend 60 years deeply involved in it. And that's what we all hope for, a job or some work that we are deeply involved in love.
That's certainly the case. I mean, I cannot really stop thinking about all these things that you mentioned in your introduction. Life in the universe, how did life come to exist? And how do we fit in to the grand scheme of things in the universe?
When I researched you, Doctor, because it would have been easy just to take the cover story and run with it and try to fill an hour full of it. But when I read a little bit about your background, and I'm feeling tingles right now, it literally raised the hair on my arm because I had never had a discussion with anybody like this about this topic. And of course, it's going to tie into something that is currently happening here on Earth. But I think people don't spend enough time thinking about the potential of what is out in space moving around. Now, I'm trying to figure out the best way to introduce this topic to everyone. So, because we can look at it one way, because I know you've been involved with talking about life in outer space and how it may affect human life here and Darwinism and etc. But let's not do that. Let's look out into space. And from your point of view, what is the potential for life in outer space? And it doesn't have to be centrally located on a planet or anything, but, you know, talk about life from your point of view in space and how we are a part of that.
Okay, my first introduction to astronomy was, in fact, to look at the interstellar dust. These are the gigantic clouds of dust, of dark material that exists across the Milky Way. They show up in patches of different shapes and so on. And in the 1960s, when I started researching this subject, or reading about this subject in Cambridge, England, there was a standard view about the dust. Astronomers had agreed some 20 years earlier that dust was just little tiny crystals of ice, trillions and trillions of these ice crystals that simply blocked out the light from distant stars, and that's why you saw them as dark clouds. Now, when I examined all the evidence, all the data, all the astronomical data that existed in 1960, this didn't seem to square up at all. It looks as though the dust in space was not ice, definitely not ice. And the more I studied the subject and the more I researched it, it was going to seem to be more and more like something comprised of the element carbon. And that already began to excite me because carbon, of course, is the main element, the sort of feature element of life. We are not made entirely of carbon, of course, but carbon is a crucial element for life. So the dust in space seemed to be involved in making particles that contained lots and lots of carbon. And so this was the beginning in the 1960s. I published dozens of scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals and so on, and began to influence astronomers to look more deeply into the cosmos, into these dark clouds that floated between the stars. And through the 1970s, new technologies were beginning to develop. For one thing, it was the beginning of the space age. The 1960s saw the first rockets and the first space objects sent into space and so on. So there were telescopes sent to space, space probes and so on. And so through the 70s, more and more information was acquired by astronomers and scientists about the cosmic dust, the dust that exists deep in space. And it was looking not just carbon, it was not just made of the simple element carbon, but by the end of the 1970s, I was beginning to argue for very complex biological molecules, structures, assemblies of atoms of the kind that is made by life itself. So this was a really crucial turning point, and I had, with my colleague, who was my mentor to begin with, and then a friend and a colleague for a long time, Sir Fred Hoyle, we worked together. He was, I think, the iconic astronomer of the 20th century. So we published lots of papers and began to publish a series of books on life in the universe, life everywhere in the universe. And the life that we contemplated at the time was microscopic life forms, bacteria, viruses, and so forth, everywhere, distributed everywhere in the universe. And the dark clouds that began in the 1960s as ice crystals, they were thought to be ice crystals. By the end of the 1970s, they were living entities. At least that's the way that me and myself and Sir Fred Hoyle and about 20 or 30 other people were discovering through our researches. It was, of course, intensely disputed and controversial because people thought that life has to be centered on the Earth. There couldn't even be microscopic life forms on a much bigger scale, certainly not on a cosmic scale. So it was, from the end of the 1970s, it was a struggle, an intellectual struggle against what I would call orthodoxy. And this was, of course, sometimes frustrating for me and sometimes also exhilarating. I think if you're discovering something against all the odds, And if you have to fight an establishment that is entrenched in wrong ideas, that is really an exciting situation to be in. And so for about the next decade, through the 70s, mid-80s, towards the end of the 80s, it was still a kind of fight, but I was beginning to see that a new subject was being born, and the subject was called astrobiology, which is essentially a marriage between astronomy and the space that you talked about at the beginning of your introduction, space and life itself.
Well, for listeners, I want them to understand that what we're talking about in that dust, and I have an older paper that actually I think is something that you spoke about. Readers, I'll just take a moment of this, is that since this type of evidence, together with chemical data, which also exists for the Murchison meteorite, is used to establish the biologic origin of microfossils in the Earth's sediment. A space origin of life would seem to be securely established. It would require an almost incredible perversity of logic to deny this data. The facts that we have them show clearly that life on Earth is derived from what appears to be an all-pervasive, galaxy-wide living system. Terrestrial life had its origins in the gas and dust clouds of space, which later became incorporated in and amplified within comets. Life was derived from and continues to be driven by sources outside the Earth, in direct contradiction to the Darwinian theory that everybody is supposed to believe. And this is what Dr. Chandra was just talking about right when he ended, about a dogma theory, I guess you might call it, of how science sometimes gets into a rut of thinking. And you know how we love to get scientists to come on and have out-of-the-box thinking. Dr. Avi Loeb from Harvard happens to be a guy that we love to call on, a doctor, because he thinks outside the box. So, Dr. Chandra, I commend you for thinking outside the box, and I see where you're at. But you have the proof because you have observations of the dust clouds. And now I want to go from the dust clouds and get a little bit closer to some solid objects. Here in this little thing I read, we talked about comets. But I can assume things like asteroids and meteors and meteorites would be capable of collecting and being the vehicle of delivery.
Exactly. Exactly. That's exactly the way it works. Comets just mop up the stuff between stars. They amplify. They provide sort of incubators for microscopic life forms to multiply in warm, watery interiors. And then when comets go around the sun, for instance, or go around a star, they throw out material, and that material is the dust that can land on planets, which are essentially living entities, microbes, bacteria, and viruses, and so on. But I mean, taking the story really back in time to classical Greece, which is where everything in Western thinking essentially started, there was a guy by name Anaxagoras who lived in around 500 BC, who saw this very clearly, intellectually. I mean, through pure thought processes. He argued that life has to be a truly cosmic phenomenon, and he thought life had to be everywhere, seeds of life have to be everywhere. And the word that you referred to in your introduction, panspermia, is essentially a coined word from Anaxagoras. Pans, meaning sort of everywhere, spanning the whole cosmos, and spermata means seeds, so seeds everywhere. And this goes back to 500 BC. So it's an old idea that we revived in the 1960s and 70s. Unfortunately for us, however, a much more influential Greek philosopher, a guy called Aristotle, turned up in the 3rd century, and he started off this business of a primordial soup. He said that life has to arise spontaneously from non-living matter on planets like the Earth. And so this was the contradiction of the older guy, Anaxagoras. But I think over the years, there's no question that even in the 19th century, Louis Pasteur began to think about these questions, and he obtained, I think, he got the first evidence that life is always derived from life that existed before. So what he did was to use processes like the fermentation of milk and or the souring of milk and the fermentation of wine. And he saw that for these processes, you need bacteria. To make bacteria, you need to start with bacteria. So life always gives rise to life. Life from life was what Pasteur said. And that connection extends right through the Earth's history. Our life is connected to earlier life through our ancestors and then through the fossil record, all the way back to the first bacterial life that has recently been discovered to be at something like 4,200 million years ago, 4.2 billion years ago, when the first rocks were formed. So this is the clearest evidence that we have now that impacting objects, impacting asteroids, comets, brought the first life to Earth. And if that is the case, then I think we can assume very safely that that process must continue, because we all know that there are impacts happening all the time, impacts of comets and asteroids, and a huge impact took place 65 million years ago and led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And then about 12,000 years ago, we think that the end of the last ice age was also helped with the impact of a cometary boloid. So comet impacts has been really happening all the time from the very first moment the Earth existed.
Well, we definitely know about comets and asteroids and all of this occurring on Earth. It's one of the topics we really love. I'm a particular fan of transient objects, so asteroids and comets and meteorites and meteoroids and planetesimals, et cetera, et cetera. I want to step back a second, though, because I want to get closer. We started in a cloud of dust that was full of microbial biological material. We're going to come a little bit closer into our solar system, maybe on the back of a comet. And over these millions and billions of years, these interactions of objects that are interacting in our solar system, that have interacted in space where the microbial dust has been present or prevalent at other times. And now we move it forward, and we have objects in our inner solar system. They may be known already, an object already known. They may be an object that hasn't been discovered yet, or an unknown object. But we're going to presume that they're carrying some microbial biological life. Now, as far as I know, we still haven't gotten to that major discovery. I'm not sure, though it's been hotly debated with this meteorite, and I need to do more research, Dr. Chandra, on Murchison meteorite, so forgive me if I don't know enough about it.
No, that's a very interesting meteorite. I think we have to spend a couple of minutes on that. It was in the 1960s that this meteorite fell in a town called Murchison in Australia, and it was collected pretty quickly after it fell, and it has been studied really intensively, examined by scientists for several decades now. But what I really find very interesting is that there have been arguments and experiments showing that there are microscopic fossils of microorganisms, even of viruses within this meteorite, this sort of rock or stone from heaven, from space. But it is very, very often disputed by the orthodox scientific establishment, who believes that there cannot be life outside. And so this stuff has to be regarded as contaminants. Now, my closest contact with that meteorite was a gentleman by name Hans D. Flug, who in 1980 made the connection with me in the UK, and he brought to me the most crushing evidence that convinced me that these were not contaminants. They were in deep interior sections of the meteorite. There was clear, unambiguous evidence for microbial material, fossils of microorganisms, even structures that look like the influenza virus or even the coronavirus. They're all stuck deep inside this meteorite. And now that's 1960s, but meteorites didn't stop with the 1960s discoveries. There have been many other meteorites. And the most recent meteorite that I had in really direct connection with was one that fell in my native country, Sri Lanka, in 2013. It was called the Polonnaruwa meteorite, and it was studied by teams of scientists in the US, in the UK, in Japan, and we found absolutely clear evidence of microbial structures within that meteorite. No question whatsoever. Even some extinct microorganisms that did not appear on the Earth for maybe billions of years, seem to be frozen, sort of locked into this structure. And so we published all this. This is all in the public domain now. But to this day, the meteoritic community has not certified this to be a meteorite because there was no video recording of the fall. Can you imagine that? It fell in a remote part of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a sort of varied geography. It's in the deep interior that this happened. And unfortunately, there was no one with a mobile phone or a camera to film it. So this was the reason given, as far as I know, for it not being recorded officially as a meteorite. But to us, people who have looked at it, groups of scientists around the world, there's no question that this is clear evidence of life forms coming into the Earth, even in the year 2013. But 2013 was not the end of the story. It's happening all the time. What happened recently was that in 2001, let me roll back to 2001, when a group of scientists from India, from UK, decided to send a balloon into the stratosphere, that is about 50 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, and collect material without any contamination. We had devices that were contaminant-free, could not be contaminated. So we brought these down, and again we found evidence of microorganisms inside the collected material. So this has happened 2001, and then again 2010, my colleague in Sheffield, Wainwright, has repeated it and found the same thing. Now, perhaps before going any further, I should tell you how much of material is implied by these experiments. We can infer from these collection experiments how much is falling down on the ground from space. And that is a fantastic amount. On every single day, every square meter of the ground receives some 20 to 200 million bacteria from space, right? That's an amazing number of bacteria. But yes. Why do we recognize it? Simply because there's maybe a million times more of these local bacteria that is sort of turning around on the Earth and being kicked about and so on. So the 200 million per square centimeter per day from space is missed.
Okay, I have to make sure that I keep, because this is just so interesting to me, Dr. Chandra. And it sounds a little bit, and I feel for you, because it sounds like on some of the meteorites and some of the things that you would love to be accepted by the rest of the scientific community, you're finding, dead ends for some of these things. I feel for you. I apologize for science for not, being open-minded enough to look at these things the way they needed to be looked at, so that we get the truth about outer space that we deserve. Now, I'm gonna ask you a question from left field, and I normally always do this in my interviews because I picked up on a little bit of information. Have you ever seen the video of STS-75, the space shuttle mission STS-75, the tether incident?
No. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna send that along to you. I want you to see that. There was something that occurred during a space shuttle mission in 1996. They call it the tether incident. I'm gonna send you the video. I want you to look at it, and then I'll ask you a question about it, and then I'll tell my listeners what your reply is. I think it will shock you. And I can't describe it because it's indescribable. Okay. But after the interview, I'll send you the link to the video. You can watch it and you can tell me what you think. So, but listeners, here we are. They sent up an experiment up into the stratosphere to measure what kind of biological material was making its way down onto the surface of Earth. Why is that important? Let's step into why that is important and how that plays a role into what is going on. Listen, if we are, as human biological material ourselves, and we are, let's say we come in contact with a some biological material. Let's call it a virus. Let's just be straight about it. Let's call it a viroid. Okay, so things that might come from outer space might include something called a viroid. And if we come in contact as humans, come in contact with that viroid, and that happened to come in from outside our atmosphere into inside our atmosphere, and we come in contact with it, it has the potential, if it has the ability to come inside our body and make changes to our body. Now, what type of changes depends on what type of material that may be, right? It may just, and I'm just going to use these as examples, just as different scenarios. It may give us the cold. It may do nothing. Come in and we pass it through, no problem. It may come in and change us genetically. Let's say the virus it embeds itself into our system. It has access into our genetic code through the way viroids work. And doctor, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know.
No, I mean, that happens. That's been a well-attested process. We know that viruses can slip into our genomes. There are processes called reverse transcriptase that essentially takes an RNA virus, makes it into DNA, and slips into our genome. And genomic studies of our DNA, of human DNA, and DNA of monkeys and apes and so on, has been done intensively since the beginning of the millennium. And what they find is just uncanny. They find that something like 6% of our genome is made of viruses that almost certainly came from outside. They are there in our genome as essentially ancestral relics of what had come in sort of millions of years ago. Maybe even during the time when we were not humans, we were great apes or monkeys or whatever. At that time, the viruses that came have been lodged in our genome, and we still carry it today. So the viruses carrying genes, carrying new genetic information that could silently slip into our genome, occasionally be switched on and produce new traits, new developments in the evolutionary history of our life, of our lives, of our ancestors. This is all well attested now, and there's no question that it has happened. I think there is no question that the evolution of life, Darwinian evolution of life, has to be regarded as a cosmic process.
That's it. That's where the mind gets blown, everybody. We're here to blow your mind, because that's basically what we're talking about. Besides what we're going to get to at the very end, which is going to blow your mind as well, We're essentially talking about the potential for the Darwinian system of evolution to be broken down if we're seriously looking at the potential of space-based biological material making its way through our atmosphere, and us as human beings through our daily doings about come in contact with things that can enter into our systems and change us genetically. Yeah. Was it a viroid that came in and changed our humanity to what it is today? And will a viroid come in and change our humanity to what it will be tomorrow and the next generation and the next generation? How did we get here? It's one of the biggest questions I think all of my listeners have, because it's one of those questions that you can pick and choose your answer. But now, Dr. Chandra, he's been involved with this for 40 years, 50 years. And I know that this work, even though I just came upon it recently because of the article that I read just a few days ago when I was introduced to Dr. Chandra, I did a little background and found this rich depth of information about the potential of what it means to have life in the universe.
Sorry, I just quickly interrupt. I think what it means is that we are connected biologically to a system that is much, much bigger than the Earth. And we are brought up in the belief that there is a closed biosphere. The biosphere of the Earth is not much beyond the surface, maybe a few miles above the surface, and everything within that realm, surface of the Earth, and maybe the thin atmosphere around it, that is sort of interactive and interconnected, but nothing beyond. But this is totally bogus now, because we know that the Earth receives biological material or potentially biological material. You mentioned viroids from outside. The Earth also loses. You've got to remember that from time to time, over geological timescales, the Earth has been struck by things like comets, of asteroids, and so on. And at each strike, you destroy some life, like in the dinosaur extinction event, you destroy life at the surface, but you also throw out from the surface a huge amount of fertile material that is laden with Earth life. And that material can reach millions and millions of other planetary systems. So in this way, I mean, it's hard to compress it in a few minutes, but it is in this manner, that in this way, that the Earth is connected biologically to at least to the entire galaxy. So we cannot regard ourselves as a closed biosphere. The biosphere of the Earth is the biosphere of the galaxy, and Darwinian evolution takes place against this huge cosmic backdrop.
And we love that, I love that point of view. I love that view on the universe. I want to be connected to the universe. I don't want to be subjected to just what keeps me inside the atmosphere. I know that there's a connection to this Earth, to everything else, because it's a big system and it all interacts with everything else. And now here we go. We're going to start getting closer to why I really called Dr. Chandra here. We talked about biological life in dust clouds far, far away outside of our solar system. We've talked about possible and potential ways that material can become a part of our solar system, entering into our solar system, our inner solar system, on a comet, on an asteroid, or etc. Occasionally, an asteroid, a comet, or etc. comes into contact with the atmosphere of Earth. It may enter into our atmosphere and fall onto the surface of Earth. If that item carries viroids of any type, we talked about the potential of life being altered, genetic genomes being altered by these viroids in the past. There's something going on right now that has really, really garnished a lot of attention, because it's really a traumatic event for those people in China who have been dealing with the COVID-19 sickness. And the reason why I contacted Dr. Chandra specifically was an article that I read where he had posited, now remember, this is having 40 years of background. This wasn't just an idea that was came about in a week or a day or a month or a year. After 40 years of research into the potential of life and how it moves and spreads and is a central part of everything that is, including Earth, he considered that this virus for COVID-19 could have entered and come into Earth's atmosphere from outer space. And I want you to tell me a little bit about that. I want to leave that to you. So where I leave you at is I contacted you, Dr. Chandra, because I read an article, and I'd never heard it before, of this idea of a potential asteroid meteorite strike bringing in something like coronavirus, the novel coronavirus now named COVID-19. Can you talk to us about that and why you think there could be a potential for that?
I really think there's no other explanation that is valid for all the evidence that we have to date. Now, what happened, as far as I can see, what happened was that on the 11th of October last year, 2019, a huge fireball was seen something like 2,000 kilometers north of Wuhan, which was the center of the epicenter, the first place at which the coronavirus was detected. This was an event that took place at midnight in North China and made the midnight skies almost like daylight. So that was a clue that made me think of maybe the COVID virus was connected with that fireball. But the fireball itself was some 2,000 kilometers north of where the virus came down first. So that wasn't easy to immediately connect it. But what has happened, I think, is that there was a cometary fragment that entered the Earth's atmosphere and sort of really darted through the stratosphere and troposphere, finally burnt out over the region where it did, north of China, in northern China. But ahead of doing that, ahead of burning out, it would have released bits and pieces, sort of fluffy aggregates, clumps of material that contained the COVID virus. And that's, I think, what happened. And the bulk of this was released when the object was just over Wuhan and over Hubei, where the first cases were reported. And so we looked at all of the other data that has been published since this came to light, and it turns out that it's a very, very peculiar illness that this COVID virus causes in humans. It's extremely weakly infective, and no one really knows how. If they say it's an infective disease, and they say that it's person-to-person transmitted. But again, the evidence for that is extremely thin. You've got to be in very close contact. Small family groups or units sometimes get affected. But those units, if you think of a family being affected almost simultaneously, that may be because they were moving in the same area, right? It was a geographical contamination of the entire area that led to this pandemic. And that's the point of view that I think has to be considered very seriously. The Chinese probably know it, because if we looked at the pictures of the Chinese authorities using high jets of very, very high-speed jets of disinfectant on the roofs of buildings, on the walls, on the streets. And so I believe that they are aware that something has come down through the skies, through the atmosphere, and infected the location itself. Now, people getting the virus, ingesting the virus and falling ill, that's a very sad situation to have. But it's a very, very low incidence of disease. And China has something like 2 billion people, and something like the percentage of people who have been affected is 0.0003% of the total population. So it's a minute fraction of the population that has been affected. And in terms of the illness, serious illness and deaths that have been recorded, more deaths are recorded from common cold, from influenza, seasonal influenza, than from this disease. So it's not lethal to that extent, but it is killing people particularly who are elderly and have health problems. But,
yes. I want to ask you a couple questions about it. First questions that I've had over a day or so after reading some of your information. Do you believe that it is harder to transmit the virus horizontally, which means person to person, than it is to receive it from your environment? So this is what I'm saying. So I believe that you have a belief that if there is any advancement of the disease, more than likely it's coming more from existing viroids still existent than it is from horizontal transfer from person to person. Because I believe I read somewhere that you found that it was harder to move from person to person than it was to receive these viruses from the ambient environment.
Exactly the case. So that's precisely the situation we have. There's a very, very, very low transmission, and people even don't know how it is transmitted from one person to another. The experts say that it's usually diseases like this are usually transmitted through droplets, sort of sprays through your mouth and nose and so on, and it's not transmitting like that. It seems to me that if you look at all the evidence, and take it all together, it looks that the environment itself is the main source of new infections. So even on that ship, where lots and lots of people have come down with it, I don't believe that the evidence for person-to-person transmission is anywhere near as strong as the possibility that the handrails of the ship, the whole, or the decks of the ship were laden with this stuff, and people confined to that ship were like prisoners, and they were almost doomed to get, with a high probability, to get the virus, because the virus was everywhere on the ship.
I want to remind the listeners, if I can, we're not on this topic to really dwell on the situation of the poor that have been afflicted. We have prayers for all of them. We wish every one of them health in the near future. The reason why I'm bringing this topic up was more about this topic of viroids from space. I mean, this because Dr. Chandra, this is a show only that features outer space and the space outside our atmosphere. So when I read your information, it's not like I wanted to talk about. I think everybody does want to express how they feel about it in some sort of way. So yes, I did have things I wanted to say, but I didn't have the outlet or the reason to talk about it. And I don't really want to talk about the disease. I want to talk about the process of how this could be true and how this could affect us in the future, how this has been affecting us in the past. How do we get to who we are today? So, Dr. Chandra, if we can go over it briefly, describe that. And this is something that he brought up. He said a comet fragment, a cometary fragment. I don't always think of those. Whenever I see a bolide or a fireball, I'm always thinking an asteroid or a meteorite. But yes, we can have unknown, undiscovered cometary fragments. And in those fragments, they have more ability to collect, contain, and keep viroid material, biological material, so that when it does interact inside the atmosphere, heats up, disperses, in this case. So you may, listener, go into Google and do the search, did the virus come in on a meteorite? And you may find some articles that say that is absolutely out of your mind.
Yeah.
If you're going to think that.
That's the reaction that I get. And people who have that get that reaction.
Not here. Okay. Because we're smarter than that, right, Doctor? Because as people who should be, they need to be open-minded. We can't change what's in another man's heart. I've discovered that over 10 years of not wanting to really try, but having to on occasion. They won't change what's in their heart, and that's okay. Yeah. But don't block your don't block your mind off to the truth. Don't close your eyes when you know that you're seeing something. And in this case, we just had a wonderful, wonderful discussion that we'd never had before about life in the universe. You may think about life and think about aliens and UFOs and all this other stuff, but that's not what life started off as. That's not the majority of life anywhere. The majority of life on Earth is microbial and it can't be seen. And now the universe, our inner solar system, our outer solar system, our stellar neighbors are surrounded by life. And I don't think that mainstream media, mainstream science has really grappled with the idea that there is so much life, microbial life, that we interact with on a daily basis. Dr. Chandra did the experiment. They sent the balloon up. They collected biological material. They were able to mathematically determine how much material was on a meter, and it was a large amount. And so if you're walking through that meter of land, depending on what fell on that meter would determine on how your body walks away.
Exactly. I mean, it's an ancient superstition that is prevalent in the East, that don't go out in the drizzle, you would catch the flu or the cold, or you will get ill. And I mean, I think that's a belief that is across many different cultures, and it probably has some element of truth. People probably decided from experiment, from experience, that this happens, and therefore it has to be regarded as being. You can't dismiss ancient superstitions entirely as nonsense. You've got to think a little bit about the origins of these superstitions.
Yes. Question: how do you continue to observe the epidemic and still maintain your research parameters? I can't because you now must in some way follow the path, follow the trail of an object that hit Earth already back in October. So now you're going to somehow track something. What is your future? How do you see yourself looking at this situation in the future?
I think in the next months and the next maybe even a year or two is really crucial. What happened in October, around the end of October, was that there was a huge splash of an object, or maybe a very loosely bound, fluffy object that contained this virus over China. But there would have been a sort of a splash around it that was carried in the winds and carried sort of seasonally deposited at different places on the surface of the Earth. So we would expect, I think, on the basis of this model, bits and pieces falling everywhere on the planet, perhaps mainly in northern latitudes, but perhaps also in low tropical latitudes and low southern latitudes. So I would expect sort of not as many cases, not as thousands of cases that we have in Wuhan, but small numbers of cases cropping up independently in other parts of the world over the next 12 months. And these may not be connected with a Chinese link. Most often in the last month or so, people have been able to link individuals who come from China and gone to another place, and there have been a few cases around these individuals. But that may not be the situation that will continue into the next year. You might have a few sporadic outcrops of this type of illness in other parts of the world. So I think it's prudent for health authorities to be vigilant, to keep a watch on what's happening, but to be locked into this model of person-to-person infection is going to be a disaster if they're going to stick to that really rigidly. It's not the main mode of spread. It doesn't look like that from the evidence. Just looking at the evidence in a very crude way, we cannot see that happening except as a minute effect. The bigger effect is the environmental contamination.
I don't know if you have this question. Another question from left field. Do children have different genetic makeups than adults do? Is there something that could protect a child genetically that an adult would be vulnerable to?
I think that seems to be the case. I mean, apparently for the coronavirus and also for diseases like the common cold, influenza, children seem to be, according to the experts that I've talked to recently, seem to have an innate immunity, a stronger immunity against succumbing to these diseases. So it could well be that one might think of children being sort of fragile and weak in many ways, but maybe their immunity is sort of geared to survival, and survival would demand that they have to stay, their bodies have to be sort of protected from even things like the common cold. So that's I've heard that mentioned by experts who should know, or people who looked at the
if they're asking questions, then they should know there's something wrong.
Yeah, I don't want to impugn all the experts, but there's a lot of arrogance around, isn't it? In all our professions.
Not here. You know what? I am blessed. I'm blessed just to be an open mind, and I have this outlet, and I get to interview wonderful people like yourself, and I'm so intrigued by every bit of it. So you know what? It can't be any better. There's no time for ego. It's time to learn. It's time to be one right now. That's all there is right now. And you just spent the last hour with me, because we're coming up to the end. Believe it or not, we're at the end. And I'm going to try to do this. Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe.
Good, well done.
Oh, wonderful. I've been saying it in my mind the whole hour. I am so blessed to have wonderful people like yourself who are involved with such an exciting and interesting topic such as this. Now, listeners, let's go over it again. We, in the end, brought to the head of the story here that Dr. Chandra has a belief that potentially the COVID-19 novel coronavirus could have made its way into Earth's atmosphere via a fragment of a comet, and that because this object was filmed over China, headed toward northeast China, and broke up over China, in its path are these areas that were most afflicted by this coronavirus, novel coronavirus. And I can tell you that he's going to continue to follow the story. Right toward the end of the show, though, he did kind of worry me, because he did say, and we should point out, if that is the case, you know, the Earth does rotate, and it rotates within its atmosphere. So even though if I'm in Texas and China's way over there, eventually Texas will end up where China's air was, and back and forth and then around. And so he said over the next 12 months or so, we'll just have to pay attention for any breakouts. But he does believe that the horizontal passage of the virus is in all sense harder if we're to understand the way biological material comes in from outside our atmosphere. Thank you. I really did enjoy this interview, because I was not expecting to get this information that I didn't know anything about. Normally some of the topics I cover have been covered so much, right? And like I said, I could have went right to the coronavirus, but as soon as I read your information, I said, this person has a lot to say, and he just taught me a lot. And I hope the listeners, if you have questions, contact me. I'll answer from what I read. Dr. Chandra, I applaud you for everything you've done and everything you will do.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's nice talking to you, and all the best.
And as soon as I'll have this recorded, because I'm recording it, I'll send you a link. And I'm going to send you a link to the STS-75. I want you to look at that video.
Okay, great. Okay.
And then Okay. Goodbye, Doctor, and thank you, listeners, for listening to this episode of Collision Course on Revolution Radio at freedomsips.com. Y'all have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye.